The third annual Trading Africa Summit is currently underway in Cape Town with a discussion focusing on Africa's investment opportunities. Joining us now to explain the talking points at the event is Sneha Shah, Head of Risk for Africa at Thomson Reuters. Sneha, let's just take a look at some of the pointers that were touched on yesterday, in particular Africa's perception or the global perception of Africa as an investment hub. What are our international counterparts thinking at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole theme of the conference this year is around the hype, the myth, and the reality. And so we really sort of looked at a number of, what are the big numbers that people are looking at as they're looking into Africa from outside. And, it's very exciting. You see the 65% of Africans have mobile phones, the $21 billion invested in infrastructure. You see all these big numbers. But then what? Are we actually seeing that translate into flows? And the answer is yes, we really are. And it's very focused right now on specific sectors and specific types of investors. But there's a real opportunity to deepen that. And beyond looking for foreign direct investment, which seems to be the focus of most countries right now, we really got to grips with the idea of why aren't more Africans investing in Africa? Because that is the key to long-term sustainable growth on the continent.
So what are the reasons for that, Sneha? Why aren't Africans investing in Africa?
So I think part of it, someone said yesterday at a panel, which I thought was great, is we're not buying our own story, which is actually, it's crazy. If you think about the potential in Africa, we all should be not just buying the story, but selling the story. If you look at how many sort of diaspora coming back, what the professional middle class looks like in Africa, 1.1 billion people, the amount of arable land, 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. The fact that sort of people are now looking for more and more sophisticated products. There's a huge rise in consumer demand. It's unfathomable why we're not investing in our own continent. And I think we did explore a little bit of the divide between people who are sitting in South Africa thinking about Africa as a different continent, and then people sitting in sub-Saharan Africa thinking about North Africa as a different continent. And how do we break down those barriers? And a lot of it is how do we actually inform and break it down country by country and say, what are the risks and opportunities of investing in each of these countries, and how do we enable Africans to help take advantage of these opportunities? Some of the communities that are, the EAC and SADC are helping to facilitate that, but we're seeing a lot more private investment across borders as well. And so it is there. We just have to make sure that it's happening more and more.
Sneha, no doubt there must be some challenges in understanding or realizing the African investment dream. Some might be political, some might be regulatory. Are there any others listed on that list?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think when we look at challenges, people have tended to think of them as blockers. But as someone said at the conference yesterday, we've tended to look at Africa through westernized eyes. And if you don't do that anymore and you start to look at Africa through African eyes, you'll realize that the challenges are actually just things that you need to get through to achieve the opportunities. And so I'll give you an example. US regulation was talked about yesterday, and the increasing scrutiny, with FATCA and some of the other US regulations. A couple of people said, oh, well, is that impeding innovation? Because now we have to have really strong know your customer sort of procedures, and then we not only need to know our customers, but we need to know our customers' customers. And how is that possible? And the answer is, it is coming, and you have to figure it out. And so we just need tools and software and solutions to be able to deal with that. But just sort of saying, oh, that's a problem, and I'm not going to go after an opportunity isn't a solution anymore. I'll give you another example. In Zimbabwe, we had a discussion this morning about the whole sort of indigenization and is that deterring foreign investment? And the answer is no. So, what's happening is people are realizing that Zimbabwe's got the second largest platinum deposits in the world behind South Africa. And so, people are investing, and we saw that the largest FDI is coming in from Nigeria, for instance. So it's just a matter of, I think, looking at the continent with different eyes and taking a longer term view.
Are you saying then that we can look at the continent with different moral eyes as well, that we can accept the paying of bribes, particularly when you talk about platinum in Zimbabwe? There's a long history of what's happened there.
No, absolutely not. I think that the whole point of getting more transparency and more framework and regulation into Africa is that we shouldn't have to look at it through those eyes. We should really look at it through moral eyes, and I don't think that's a westernized opinion. I think that's just how we should be doing business anywhere in the world. But how do we then help those frameworks actually come into place? How do we help deepen capital markets? How do we help the rule of law in some of these countries? I think that's what we need to focus on, as opposed to just saying it's difficult, therefore I won't do it.
Sneha, one nation that happens to be investing in Africa is China, more focused on infrastructure when we take a look at the rest of the continent. But also recently in South Africa, we saw a Chinese property developer purchase some land here. Are we seeing a skills transfer taking place there, where the Chinese don't just come in, do their job and then leave again, but skills transfers and development of entrepreneurial skills in the countries that they invest in?
Yes, so we're definitely seeing, as the Chinese investment deepens, we're seeing diversification. So it started off very much around sort of mining and sort of minerals, and now it's sort of moved into infrastructure, and now we're seeing more and more sort of deepening. And as you see that, obviously you'll see the transfer of skills. The other thing that's very interesting that came up this morning is, as Africans, we should start to look at how do we tap into the massive pension funds in China and start thinking about how do we tap into that fund and start getting real investment for the long term into Africa from China.
So how do we do that?
I think it's just a matter of being open and being more, I guess, transparent about what the opportunities are in investing into Africa. People used to look at Africa as a one homogeneous entity, and it's really not. And what we've been doing in this conference is breaking it down, sort of country by country, region by region, to say, Zambia looks very different than Kenya or Uganda, and so what are the different opportunities and risks, and where would you invest? Where would you place your bets? In Tanzania, you'd be looking at the gas industry right now. In Kenya, you'd probably be looking at oil. In Zambia, you're looking at copper or agriculture. In Nigeria, you might start looking at agriculture now, but really starting to look at each country on its own merits, as opposed to sort of lumping it together.
Sneha, you've mentioned some positive attributes that a lot of the African countries have. What are we doing wrong?
I think it's not telling the story well enough. So one of the things we talked about is that everyone's doing some really great things, but on their own, and we need to come together more. So experiences like Trading Africa and the conference, and even just community building, and I've seen the central banks now coming together more and more as forums to talk about what they're doing in the technology space. Those are the things that will broaden and deepen the markets, but also attract foreign investors, because they start to see stability and they start to see that there's long-term growth plans across all of these countries.
Sneha, I'd like us to touch on some Africans who might be expats living in other places of the world, coming back home. You yourself were born in Kenya and went to the US and South Africa and are coming back. I take it that's also something that's very important, getting back the skills that we might have exported in the past.
Absolutely. So we've seen a brain drain through the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s in Africa, and we're seeing a complete reversal of that. So whether it's universities now taking very seriously the need to educate the next generation of citizens, or as you mentioned, the diaspora coming back, there's absolutely a story of the reversal, and we have to sort of tell that story as well. So as you mentioned, I came back to Africa to be part of the story, but I was in Lagos 2 weeks ago, and almost everyone I met had been in London or New York and had decided to come back to be part of the story in Nigeria. And out of my school friends in Nairobi, I think there's only 2 people who haven't come back to Africa. And so I think if you start thinking about what the power of that is, and all of these professionals who've been sort of abroad who are now coming back to empower and be part of the story, it absolutely will sort of, it'll help reverse that brain drain, as well as sort of the longer term focus on universities and how do we skill build. You're seeing stuff like IBM building a research facility in Nairobi as well. That's really going to help the long-term technology development of that country.